Alright everyone, so I finally decided to pick up a Jinhao 20 fountain pen. In case you're unfamiliar, then this is basically like an affordable, retractable fountain pen. It's supposed to be a more affordable version of the Pilot Vanishing Point, or in this case specifically, the Jinhao 20 is supposed to be more of like a knockoff version or affordable version of the Pilot Decimo, which is supposed to be like ever so slightly thinner, a little more lightweight from my understanding. Now, I don't have any experience with the Pilot Vanishing Point or the Decimo. I don't have either of those in my collection as of yet, but I would love to get my hands on one, if not both of them, someday. But in the meantime, I basically just wanted to pick up the Jinhao 20 just to kind of see how it compares to the Jinhao 10, which if you've been around my channel for a little while, then you may already know basically like my thoughts on this. The first thing being that I feel like whatever ink I put in here dries out incredibly fast. If I don't use it for like 2 or 3 days, then I feel like the ink just completely dries up and it has issues with hard starting. The second issue that I have with this is that I find it to be pretty heavy, especially since I do have an unorthodox grip. I don't typically hold my pen to where it like lays on the perlicue here. It usually rests like on my index finger up here, and so I find that any pen or writing utensil that is on like the heavier side, because they are made of like metal and stuff, then I do feel like they tend to make my hands feel a little bit more fatigued after long writing sessions. And so one of the things that did attract me to the Jinhao 20 is just that it's supposed to be lighter weight, not quite as heavy as the Jinhao 10. So I think that that will definitely help with kind of like the fatigue that I've experienced with this heavier one. Now, the reason why I was on the fence about getting this when it first came out, which correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they released the Jinhao 20 kind of like around the end of 2025. But the reason why I didn't really want to pick it up at the time was because I had so many months of trying to fuss around with the Jinhao 10 and just trying to get it to work for me. And so around the time that the 20 came out, then I just was pretty sick of the 10. And so I wasn't really sure if I was ready to pick up a Jinhao 20 and unfortunately probably go through like the same frustrations. But it's been a few months. I think at this point I am ready to finally test it out and just kind of see how it compares, since it's been a while since I have purchased a fountain pen, and I thought that this one would be an interesting one to introduce to my collection. So let's go ahead and start off with kind of like the external or aesthetic differences between the two. Alright, so I did turn on some overhead false lighting, so hopefully you can kind of see it a little bit better, but upon first impressions, then the Jinhao 10 is definitely thicker than the Jinhao 20, and I feel like you can really notice that in the back here as well. I don't feel like the 20 is quite as long either, but as you can see here, kind of by where like the retracting like button is, I guess, then the Jinhao 20 is just ever so slightly shorter. So that can definitely be something that you might want to pay attention to. I think it's more ideal for those of us who have smaller hands and therefore don't need a very long writing instrument. In terms of kind of like this top half of both of the pens, I do feel like they look relatively similar. It's just that the Jinhao 20 is just ever so slightly thinner. The body on the Jinhao 10 is a little bit thicker, and so that is another thing that you may want to keep in mind if you are planning on picking one of these up. And unfortunately, I don't have like a scale or a weight to compare the two, but just feeling how heavy each of them are, then I can definitely tell that the Jinhao 10 is just much heavier than the Jinhao 20. And I think that just has to do with the fact that the body is pretty much like a transparent plastic, whereas the Jinhao 10, I'm pretty sure, has like metal on the inside, and so it just definitely adds to the weight. So I can confidently say that I am quite excited to have this Jinhao 20, and I'm looking forward to trying it out. I don't remember the exact colorway that I got. I think it's like the translucent black with like gold hardware or whatever, but I'll leave the specific name down below in the description in case you want to pick up the same one. But I got this off of Amazon, and I believe it was on sale for like 11 bucks, or maybe that's just the regular price for it. But if I recall correctly, when I purchased the Jinhao 10, then that was around like $20, and I think it might have gone up a little bit by now. But the Jinhao 20, then this one is kind of around like the $11 mark as far as when I purchased it, so definitely more affordable even so than the Jinhao 10, and I'm pretty sure that has to do with the materials. But I think that about does it for kind of like my first impressions. I don't really know what else to say about them. Now let's go ahead and just retract the two here. So I'm not sure how well it's picking up on camera, unfortunately. I think it's having a hard time focusing, but here is the Jinhao 10. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but I've always had an issue with this one being slightly like misaligned. Not that the tines are misaligned by any means, but just kind of the way that it comes out of the pen. It's not completely straight or horizontal rather, so it always came out at a slight angle, but I don't see that to be the case so far with the Jinhao 20 yet. So I think that that is definitely a good sign that they have perhaps improved kind of like the retractability mechanism. Another thing that you may notice kind of like from this angle here, definitely the body of the Jinhao 20 is slimmer, but then this is also where you can kind of get a good comparison of the clips as well. The clip for the Jinhao 20 is also slimmer in comparison to the Jinhao 10, so that is also just another thing that you may want to keep in mind. I think it's probably safe to say that as far as like external features, then the Jinhao 20 just leans like on the slimmer, smaller side compared to the Jinhao 10. So before I show you the inner pieces of both of the pens, I do want to just note that when you are twisting open the pens, then they do kind of twist off differently. So for the Jinhao 10 then, as you can see, when you twist it off, then this metal band comes off with the second half of the body, but when you twist off the Jinhao 20, then the band remains on the top portion of the fountain pen here, and then you don't have the band that comes off with this portion down here. So I thought that that was just kind of interesting, and I wonder why that is, why they didn't decide to just keep like the same functionality, I guess, or appearances rather. So just something that I thought was worth noting and kind of interesting. All right, so in terms of the inner workings for both of the pens, then I forgot to mention, but the nib sizes that I got for both of these fountain pens are both fines, so I think that'll definitely be important when we go back to kind of like test the pens out and whatnot. But in terms of the converter as well as kind of like the nib and like the metal sleeve, then they're practically the same. I really don't notice any differences. I'm assuming that they kind of just use like the same interior pieces for both of the pens, since they seem to be about the same size and pretty much identical. So that's just for anyone that was curious on how the inner parts looked like, I suppose. So that about does it for kind of like my first impressions and comparing the external and internal mechanisms with one another. What I want to do next is actually do kind of like a comparison test between the sealing mechanisms of both pens, just because like I mentioned at the beginning, the Jinhao 10, then I've definitely had issues with it just drying out or hard starting if I didn't use it for like 2 or 3 days straight. I basically wanted to go ahead and test it to the Jinhao 20 because I did kind of hear that the Jinhao 20 is supposed to be better at sealing itself, or like the pen is supposed to have a better sealing mechanism. I'm not sure if it has something to do with like the plastic instead of the metal, but I did want to go ahead and just compare it. So I was thinking that maybe I would just go ahead and fill them up both with the same color and come back in 3 days and basically just like see if they both have issues hard starting, or if one is better than the other, or for some reason they both work just fine. I'd be very interested to see that, and hopefully you guys are too. So I want to go ahead and fill them both with this Sailor and Kingdom Note ink. I thought about doing like a black ink instead initially, but I kind of wanted to do like a colored ink instead, just to kind of like show off like any shading qualities and see if like the nib affects that in any kind of way, I guess. So I thought that this would be a little bit more interesting than black. And I thought that it would be a good idea to just stick with the same ink. That way it can stay consistent between the two pens. Alright, so here is day one, freshly filled, working right off the bat. I will say that I was kind of having a little bit of a struggle getting the Jinhao 20 to write. I'm not sure if it was just because it was like still brand new and just really needed the ink to like fill up the feed and whatnot, but after a little bit it did get going, so I think that it was writing pretty nicely. A big difference right off the bat is I'm not sure why the Jinhao 20, although they are both fine nibs, the Jinhao 20 seems to be writing a little bit thicker than the Jinhao 10, which is very interesting. However, I do prefer the way that it looks with the Jinhao 20 more. I do feel like I see a little bit more of like that shading quality that I was looking for with this ink. So I think that it is interesting to see like how the ink can differ between basically like two different pens. So right now it is Monday, April 20th, around 7 p.m. So I think what I will do is come back like Thursday around the same time, and that'll be about like 72 hours, and then we can go ahead and like finish off this page and then just kind of see how they each perform after it's been 3 days without any use. I'm just going to leave my pens here at my desk and basically just compare the sealing mechanisms between the two pens. So that's the plan. I'll be back in about 72 hours. All right, moment of truth. It is currently Thursday, April 23rd, and it is 6:54, so right about the 72-hour mark from when I was filming this on Monday. So let's go ahead and just kind of see how these pens perform now. So just like before, I'm starting off with the Jinhao 10. As you can see, it is definitely having difficulties starting. And this was one of the issues that I was having with this pen before. So yeah, at this point then the nib is pretty much dried up. It does not want to write at all. And just for some confirmation that I did not empty it or change anything in between now and Monday when I last filmed, as you can see there's still definitely ink inside of there, so that is not looking good. I am very hopeful that the Jinhao 20 will be able to write today, but I think I'm just going to give up on the Jinhao 10 for now. But let's go ahead and try out the Jinhao 20. So this one is writing immediately. There is just like the tiniest little bit of like hard starting. The ink has definitely, is it oxidized, where it just appears a little bit more, or perhaps like the water evaporated from the ink and that's why it just looks a little darker and a little more pigmented than the initial swatch immediately after I inked up the pen on day 1. So day 3. Alright, so there was the test. I'm really glad that I tried this experiment because I wanted to just see if it was perhaps just an issue with the Jinhao 10, and probably just an issue with the Jinhao 10 that I have. I've heard so many great things from other people having really good experience with their Jinhao 10s, and so it could just be that unfortunately mine ended up being a dud. But as we all saw today, it was definitely not wanting to start whatsoever. I'm sure if I were to apply like a little bit of water or dip the nib into water that it would loosen up the pigments again and get the ink running again, but I didn't feel like going to grab a cup of water or anything and doing that, so I'm really glad that the Jinhao 20 was able to write up right away. You can certainly tell that it has oxidized or evaporated just because the ink definitely looks a little different than when we first inked it up on Monday or the first day. So yeah, I just thought that that was interesting, and I think that is to be expected, especially if you haven't used your ink in like a couple of days. I think typically with like a colored ink as well, then it may just look a little bit dark at first, but once you start writing with it and the ink kind of like mixes up together again, then it should basically come back to this color eventually. So yeah, well, there we have it. There's the Jinhao 10 and Jinhao 20 performance comparison, if you will. Hopefully you guys found this helpful. I definitely found it helpful, and I'm really glad that I did it. I'm disappointed with the Jinhao 10, but I was expecting that result anyway, just because that was already something I was experimenting before, and so I kind of would have felt dumb if I wasn't able to prove it in today's video. But here we go. Here is some proof, unfortunately. So I do know that there have been many suggestions out there to basically like troubleshoot the Jinhao 10, but I've said this before, and although I do very much appreciate the suggestions and the ideas, there are just a lot of fountain pens that I do have that work perfectly fine without any fuss. Once I ink it up, then it just works the way that it does. I don't have to mess around with it or anything, and so I don't want to have to do any specific or any extra steps for my Jinhao 10 just to get it to work. So there is that. I am happy that I now have a Jinhao 20 that I can kind of play around with and just kind of get a little bit more experience with that, like retractability of like the fountain pen, since I don't have any other retractable fountain pen aside from the Jinhao 10. So now I'm happy to have the 20, and perhaps if my thoughts on it end up changing like in the future or something, or if I notice something really like drastic, then I can definitely do like another update video, maybe like a few or like 6 months from now or something like that. So anyway, I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know if you own either of these pens and what your experiences have been like. Hopefully you found it helpful, and if you have any other video recommendations on anything that you would like to see from me, like stationery related, then please leave them down below in the comments. I love hearing from you guys, and I love getting your feedback and ideas on things. So yeah, thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.